Trump introduced punitive tariffs on China, as well as trying to rebalance the trade deficit to try and contain China's economic rise.
The announcement from Beijing was as thunderous as it was calculated. In the wake of Donald Trump's election to the presidency and his immediate declaration of sweeping tariffs on a range of foreign trade partners, China retaliated in a decisive and unnerving move. It imposed a ban on the exportation of several critical materials vital to global manufacturing and technology sectors. This singular action sent ripples of uncertainty throughout international markets, boardrooms, and government offices across the world. China's decision was not merely a defensive maneuver, but a clear message about the new realities of global power, competition, and the fragile dependencies underpinning modern economies. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. China's dominance over the production and refinement of critical materials had long been an open secret. Elements like rare earth metals, specialized minerals used in everything from smartphones and electric cars to advanced military hardware, were areas where China had systematically positioned itself as an indispensable global supplier. Over decades, through a mix of strategic investment, environmental tolerance for the messy business of extraction, and shrewd trade policies, China had secured a chokehold on these resources. This advantage had rarely been wielded openly, until now. The timing of the ban was no coincidence. Trump's tariff announcement was not selective. It struck broadly at many of America's trade partners, but China felt particularly targeted. Although the tariffs were framed under the rhetoric of protecting American industries and restoring jobs, Beijing interpreted them as a direct challenge to its economic rise. Rather than opting for a measured response through incremental tariffs or diplomatic protests, China chose a path that would cause immediate and widespread pain across multiple sectors reliant on a steady flow of critical materials. Almost overnight, industries that had long taken supply chains for granted found themselves scrambling. The tech industry, which depends heavily on rare earth elements for the production of semiconductors, batteries, and advanced computing devices, faced immediate stock market jolts. Automakers, particularly those venturing aggressively into electric vehicles, suddenly confronted skyrocketing material costs and the possibility of production slowdowns. The renewable energy sector, too, heavily reliant on Chinese materials for solar panels and wind turbines, saw their futures clouded with uncertainty. What made China's move so strategically devastating was the essential invisibility of these materials to the everyday consumer. Unlike steel or oil, critical materials do not occupy a visible place in the public imagination. Yet, they are the backbone of countless products that define modern life. Without access to these elements, the production lines that build everything from smartphones to satellites could grind to a halt. China's control over these resources was not easily replaceable. Alternative suppliers existed in theory: Australia, the United States itself, parts of Africa. But ramping up production elsewhere would take years of investment, regulatory clearance, and environmental remediation. The broader implications of the ban quickly came into focus. On a geopolitical level, it showcased how interdependent and vulnerable global economies had become. Trump's tariffs were intended to assert American strength and self-reliance, but they simultaneously revealed how entangled and dependent the U.S. was on global supply networks. China's response made it clear that economic nationalism would not occur in a vacuum. It would provoke counter-moves that could deeply wound those who initiated them. Financial markets reacted with predictable volatility. Technology stocks plummeted first, followed by broader sell-offs in sectors ranging from automotive to energy. Investors began recalibrating their expectations for corporate profits, particularly for companies reliant on complex international supply chains. The prospect of inflation reared its head, as the scarcity of critical materials suggested that costs would be pushed higher across a wide swath of industries. Economists warned of possible stagflation, a combination of stagnant economic growth and rising prices, that could be triggered if production bottlenecks persisted. Beyond the markets, policymakers faced a daunting new reality. The U.S. government, long aware but complacent about its dependence on foreign sources of critical materials, now faced an urgent strategic imperative. Efforts to incentivize domestic mining and processing, long mired in environmental and regulatory debates, were thrust to the forefront of national conversation. Questions that had previously lingered on the margins: how to secure supply chains, how to invest in alternatives, how to balance environmental concerns with economic necessity, now demanded immediate answers. Internationally, alliances strained under the pressure of the moment. Other nations affected by the tariffs and the subsequent Chinese export ban had to choose sides carefully. Some sought to coordinate responses with Washington, but others, wary of being caught in the crossfire of a titanic economic confrontation, pursued their own bilateral negotiations with Beijing. In capitals around the world, governments reassessed their strategic vulnerabilities and quietly reconsidered their dependencies on both American markets and Chinese resources. The ban also had cultural and symbolic reverberations. In China, state media hailed the move as a display of national strength and sovereignty. It fed into a broader narrative of resilience against Western pressure, reinforcing the domestic legitimacy of the Chinese leadership. In the United States, the reaction was more conflicted. Some hailed Trump's tariffs as a long overdue stance against unfair trade practices, while others lamented the unintended consequences that had left vital American industries exposed. Strategically, China's choice to use critical materials as a weapon rather than retaliatory tariffs marked a significant evolution in how economic warfare could be waged. Traditional trade wars had typically involved duties, quotas, or embargoes on consumer goods. This was something far deeper and more sophisticated, targeting the arteries of high-value, high-technology industries rather than the bloodstream of general consumer goods. It represented a maturation of economic statecraft, one that took full advantage of a multipolar global economy where asymmetries in resources could be as powerful as armies. In corporate boardrooms across the globe, the ban forced a brutal reassessment of supply chain strategies. Companies that had long prioritized efficiency and cost-saving over resilience now faced hard choices. Some initiated plans to diversify their supply chains, seeking out secondary suppliers even at higher costs. Others doubled down on innovation, investing in research aimed at developing alternative materials or entirely new manufacturing processes that could reduce dependency on Chinese sources. Academia and research institutions also experienced a jolt. Funding for materials science, mining engineering, and sustainable resource extraction suddenly became a national priority in ways it hadn't been for decades. Universities found themselves at the nexus of a new arms race, not for weapons, but for knowledge that could secure technological and economic sovereignty in an era of constrained resource flows. At a more granular level, the ban reshaped everyday expectations around technology and consumer goods. Delays in product launches, reduced availability of certain electronic devices, and rising costs became tangible indicators of a broader geopolitical struggle. What once seemed like abstract policy decisions now touched the lives of ordinary consumers, from delayed smartphone upgrades to more expensive electric vehicles. The world's understanding of globalization itself also shifted. For decades, globalization had been equated with openness, efficiency, and mutual prosperity. Now, a darker vision emerged, one where globalization also meant vulnerability, dependency, and strategic risk. Economic relationships were no longer seen purely through the lens of markets, but also as tools of power and leverage. Nations began to think in terms of economic security as national security, blurring the lines between commerce and defense policy. China's ban did not just disrupt supply chains, it altered the mental map by which businesses and governments navigated the global economy. It illuminated the extent to which traditional notions of economic power were insufficient for understanding the 21st century world. Raw materials, once thought of as commodities of diminishing strategic value in a service-driven economy, were reasserted as foundational to technological and military supremacy. The confrontation also highlighted deeper philosophical divides between the United States and China regarding the nature of economic relations. To Washington, trade was historically seen through a commercial lens, with national interest defined largely by macroeconomic indicators like GDP growth and employment rates. To Beijing, trade was inherently strategic, part of a long-term game of national strengthening and global positioning. The clash of these worldviews, laid bare by the critical materials ban, suggested that future economic conflicts would not be mere squabbles over tariffs, but existential contests over resources and capabilities. Even as the immediate fallout played out in financial markets and corporate offices, longer-term implications loomed larger. Countries began reconsidering resource nationalism, thinking seriously about securing and controlling their own sources of critical materials. Conversations around friendshoring, reorganizing supply chains among geopolitical allies, gained momentum. Strategic stockpiling of essential minerals, once a relic of Cold War thinking, found renewed relevance. China's move, while bold, was also fraught with risk. The ban could accelerate efforts among other countries to break their dependence on Chinese resources, just as the oil shocks of the 1970s spurred major investments in alternative energy and fuel efficiency. Yet, in the immediate term, China had demonstrated its capacity to cause significant disruption without firing a single shot, simply by closing its ports to a few select shipments. The entire episode underscored a basic but often overlooked truth of international relations. Power is not just about who can produce the most wealth or build the most powerful weapons. It is also about who controls the bottlenecks, the choke points, the indispensable flows of goods and materials without which modern economies cannot function. In this arena, China had shown itself to be a master. As markets fluctuated and leaders strategized, the world began to adapt to a new reality. The era of easy globalization had ended, replaced by an age of contested interdependence. Every shipment of critical materials, every mining project, every trade deal would now be evaluated not just for its economic benefit, but for its strategic implications. The immediate event, the banning of critical materials exports, was seismic, but it also marked the beginning of a deeper, more enduring transformation. In choosing to wield its resource power so openly, China had redefined the parameters of economic competition. From Washington to Brussels to Tokyo, policymakers would now operate under a new set of assumptions about vulnerability, resilience, and the uses of economic strength in a fracturing world order. In the intricate dance of global commerce and politics, the step taken by China in response to Trump's tariffs was not just a reaction, it was a pivot toward a more contested, multipolar economic future. As industries scrambled, as governments recalibrated, and as the world's economic map was redrawn, the ban stood as a stark reminder that the age of uncontested economic interdependence was over, and that the battles of the future would be fought not only with tariffs and treaties, but with the very building blocks of technology and modern life. The global economy, complex and intricately bound by countless silent threads, had been violently jolted. China's export ban on critical materials, prompted by President Trump's aggressive tariff policies, initiated not just a crisis, but a transformation in how nations conceptualized power, production, and security. The immediate chaos was evident, but beneath it, deeper movements were beginning to take shape. Movements that would fundamentally reconfigure alliances, industrial strategies, and the very future of technological innovation. This awakening prompted a flurry of activity in capitals across the world. New legislation was rushed through parliaments, focusing on domestic mining, materials science research, and strategic investment in alternative sources. In the United States, bipartisan urgency emerged, a rarity in a polarized political environment, as lawmakers recognized the existential nature of the threat. Massive funding packages were assembled to encourage mining and refining projects within U.S. borders, despite the environmental controversies that such industries often sparked. Strategic stockpiles of rare earth elements, which had once seemed an anachronistic holdover from Cold War logistics, were expanded with vigor. In Europe, the European Union fast-tracked its critical raw materials action plan, seeking not only to diversify supply chains, but also to build stronger strategic partnerships with resource-rich nations outside China's orbit. Meanwhile, a subtler but equally critical change was underway: the reimagining of industrial strategy itself. For decades, economic orthodoxy had favored just-in-time manufacturing, global outsourcing, and cost optimization. Efficiency reigned supreme. Now, resilience became the watchword. Corporations no longer judged supply chains solely on their cost, but increasingly on their vulnerability. It was not enough for a supply chain to be fast and cheap. It had to be secure, politically insulated, and diversified. Major tech firms quietly shifted their procurement strategies. Some began building relationships with Australian, Canadian, and African mining companies, offering investments and long-term purchase agreements in exchange for guaranteed supplies. Others funded academic research into the development of synthetic alternatives to critical materials, or recycling technologies that could reclaim rare elements from discarded electronics. Still others began to experiment with entirely new materials, seeking to bypass traditional dependencies altogether. Innovation, previously driven by market demand and consumer taste, was now being shaped by geopolitical necessity. China, observing these moves, was not idle. It leveraged its dominance to negotiate from a position of strength with other major economies, particularly in Asia and Africa. It deepened its influence over critical resource-producing regions through infrastructure investments, financial assistance, and diplomatic outreach. The Belt and Road Initiative, previously seen primarily as a tool for expanding Chinese trade influence, now took on new strategic significance as a mechanism for resource security. Ports, roads, and railways constructed under its banner were increasingly viewed as arteries for the transport of critical materials to Chinese industry. Beyond the maneuvering of states and corporations, cultural shifts were also becoming visible. Public discourse in many countries started to reflect an awareness of material scarcity and resource geopolitics. Documentaries explored the hidden lives of rare earth miners, the environmental toll of extraction, and the strategic vulnerabilities baked into modern life. Books and articles about the geopolitics of minerals climbed bestseller lists. School curricula, especially in STEM fields, began to introduce modules not only on software engineering and data science, but also on the material sciences essential to maintaining technological civilization. One profound and often overlooked consequence of China's export ban was its effect on environmental policy debates. Historically, environmentalists and industrialists had often been at odds, but the crisis exposed the complicated trade-offs between environmental protection and industrial sovereignty. Efforts to expand mining operations in North America and Europe were met with immediate resistance from environmental groups concerned about habitat destruction, water pollution, and carbon emissions. Yet governments increasingly framed these projects as matters of national security, painting opposition as not merely inconvenient, but potentially dangerous. This created new political fault lines, with green activists finding themselves sometimes cast, unfairly or not, as unwitting impediments to national resilience. The technology sector faced similar ethical dilemmas. The push to innovate alternatives to Chinese-sourced materials often involved developing new extraction methods or synthetic processes that carried their own environmental risks. The race to secure resources forced companies and governments alike to weigh ecological sustainability against strategic necessity, a tension that was unlikely to resolve easily or cleanly. International diplomacy also began to transform under the pressure of the new reality. Traditional alliances like NATO found themselves considering economic security in addition to military matters. Discussions that once focused exclusively on troop deployments and deterrence strategies now included assessments of supply chain vulnerabilities and resource dependencies. New partnerships formed around the shared goal of securing access to critical materials. The United States, for instance, initiated talks with countries like Australia, Canada, and even Greenland, exploring how to create an allied network of critical materials production and refinement. Emerging economies, particularly those rich in natural resources, found themselves in an unusual position of leverage. Countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, which possesses vast reserves of cobalt, and Chile, home to significant lithium resources, became courted by multiple powers eager to lock down supply agreements. This dynamic threatened to usher in a new form of resource nationalism, where governments sought to maximize the strategic value of their mineral wealth rather than merely exporting it for immediate profit. At the same time, multinational corporations faced moral quandaries as they navigated these new realities. Mining operations in politically unstable regions often came with risks of corruption, human rights abuses, and environmental degradation. The urgency of securing supply chains sometimes clashed with corporate social responsibility pledges, forcing difficult conversations in boardrooms about ethics, public relations, and long-term brand reputation. Another less visible but equally critical consequence of China's export ban was the acceleration of research into material efficiency. Engineers and scientists, confronted with the prospect of chronic material shortages, began pushing for technological designs that required fewer critical inputs. Modular designs that made it easier to replace worn-out parts without discarding entire devices gained favor. Products were reimagined to be lighter, simpler, and more recyclable. The trend toward right-to-repair legislation also gained momentum, spurred by a combination of consumer advocacy and the stark economic reality of material scarcity. Even at the consumer level, attitudes began to shift. In wealthier countries where consumers were accustomed to rapid cycles of technological obsolescence, there was a slow but perceptible movement toward valuing durability and repairability over constant upgrades. Some major tech brands capitalized on this shift, marketing products that emphasized longevity, recyclability, and minimal environmental impact. What started as a reactive adjustment to supply constraints gradually evolved into a broader cultural reevaluation of consumption habits. In education, new interdisciplinary fields began to emerge. University programs combined material sciences, environmental studies, economics, and geopolitics to produce a new generation of experts capable of navigating the tangled web of resource competition, technological innovation, and international diplomacy. Scholarships and research grants flowed into these areas, creating a talent pipeline aimed specifically at addressing the vulnerabilities exposed by China's export ban. On the military front, the implications were equally profound. Advanced weaponry, from guided missiles to stealth aircraft to secure communication systems, relied heavily on critical materials. Defense departments around the world undertook exhaustive reviews of their supply chains, uncovering uncomfortable levels of dependency. Procurement policies were updated to prioritize domestically sourced materials, or, at the very least, materials sourced from trusted allies. New investment poured into defense-oriented materials research, aiming to develop alternatives that could be rapidly produced under conditions of geopolitical stress. Perhaps one of the most significant long-term consequences of the crisis was its impact on global governance. International institutions, already strained by years of shifting political tides, faced new calls for frameworks to manage competition over critical resources. Discussions at the United Nations and other global fora explored the possibility of treaties aimed at ensuring fair access to critical materials, preventing monopolistic practices, and safeguarding environmentally sustainable extraction methods. However, the deepening mistrust between major powers often hampered meaningful progress, leading instead to a more fragmented and competitive international order. Amid all these transformations, China maintained a careful balancing act. The ban, while effective in showcasing its leverage, also exposed its own vulnerabilities. Chinese industries, particularly high-tech manufacturers, depended on global markets just as much as global manufacturers depended on Chinese resources. The leadership in Beijing had to navigate the risk of overplaying its hand, ensuring that while it demonstrated strength, it did not catalyze an irreversible decoupling that could ultimately harm its own economic interests. In parallel, China's own domestic industries accelerated efforts towards self-sufficiency in areas where they remained dependent on foreign technology. Just as Western countries scrambled to reduce their reliance on Chinese materials, China moved aggressively to reduce its reliance on Western semiconductors, software, and machinery. This mutual decoupling, while still partial and uneven, suggested a future in which major economic blocs would increasingly seek to internalize key segments of their supply chains. As the dust from the initial confrontation settled, it became clear that the world had crossed a threshold. The global economic system, once premised on a shared assumption of open trade and interdependence, had entered a new phase marked by competition, strategic resource management, and cautious realignment. Globalization had not ended, but it had become more brittle, more segmented, and more tightly interwoven with questions of power and security. The crisis of critical materials was ultimately a story about the collision between technological ambition and the stubborn realities of the physical world. It revealed how even the most advanced societies were anchored to the earth in ways they had forgotten or chosen to ignore. It showed that power in the 21st century would not only be measured by innovation or wealth, but also by control over the elemental foundations of modern life. In this changed world, success would go to those who understood that resilience mattered as much as efficiency, that alliances needed to be built not just on shared values but on shared vulnerabilities, and that the future would be shaped as much by the management of scarcity as by the pursuit of abundance. The era of complacent interdependence was over. The age of contested resources had begun. The strategic tremors unleashed by China's ban on critical material exports continued to unfold with an almost geological inevitability, reshaping industries, military planning, scientific research, and even the psychology of global leadership. Beneath the immediate scramble for alternatives and supply chain diversification, deeper systemic shifts began to germinate, shifts that would not merely patch over vulnerabilities, but profoundly redefine how power was conceived, exerted, and defended in a more fractious world. One of the earliest domains to experience an irreversible transformation was the landscape of global industrial investment. For decades, multinational corporations had sought to optimize production through complex, sprawling supply chains spread across dozens of countries, chasing lower labor costs and tax efficiencies. The shock administered by China's export ban, however, planted an insistent seed of doubt about this model's viability. No matter how cheap or efficient a supplier might be, if access to critical inputs could be severed overnight by political decree, then the entire edifice of globalization rested on foundations far less stable than previously imagined. New strategies quickly emerged. Resource adjacency became a guiding principle for future industrial placement. Companies sought to relocate key manufacturing nodes closer to reliable sources of essential materials. Rather than centralizing massive operations in a handful of low-cost hubs, businesses began distributing production across multiple strategically chosen regions. Flexibility and proximity to materials, rather than mere labor cost savings, determined the calculus of expansion and investment. Emerging economies that could offer both political stability and access to critical resources found themselves in an unprecedented position of bargaining strength, able to demand higher standards for labor conditions, environmental protections, and revenue-sharing agreements. Parallel to this redistribution of industrial geography, the global financial sector began developing new instruments tailored to a world where material scarcity was an ever-present risk. Investment funds specializing in critical minerals, strategic stockpile management, and sustainable resource extraction gained prominence. These were not mere speculative ventures. They became essential tools for institutional investors seeking to hedge against the geopolitical shocks that now routinely disrupted traditional market predictions. Sovereign wealth funds, particularly in resource-poor but capital-rich nations, initiated aggressive campaigns to secure long-term stakes in mining operations, rare earth processing facilities, and next-generation recycling technologies. The insurance industry also evolved in response. Traditional political risk insurance, once focused primarily on expropriation or civil unrest, expanded its coverage to include sudden export bans, critical resource embargoes, and supply chain disruptions tied to material scarcity. Premiums for companies heavily reliant on vulnerable supply chains rose sharply, incentivizing a profound rethinking of operational risk across virtually every sector. While businesses and financial institutions adapted with a kind of feral pragmatism, governments faced a different and even more daunting set of challenges. Traditional national security paradigms, still largely shaped by Cold War-era assumptions about military force projection and deterrence, proved inadequate for the emerging reality. Access to resources was no longer a marginal economic issue. It was now a core element of national defense. Without reliable supplies of rare earths, advanced semiconductors, and critical battery minerals, even the most sophisticated militaries would find themselves crippled. New branches within defense ministries and intelligence agencies were established, dedicated solely to resource security. Analysts who had previously focused on troop movements or satellite imagery now pored over mining data, shipping routes, corporate acquisitions, and geological surveys. Geopolitical risk maps were redrawn, prioritizing not only flashpoints like the Taiwan Strait or the Persian Gulf, but also seemingly obscure locales like the lithium-rich salt flats of South America or the cobalt mines of Central Africa. These regions, once on the periphery of strategic thought, now occupied central positions in the calculations of great power competition. A corresponding renaissance occurred in infrastructure planning. Maritime choke points critical for the shipment of raw materials, the Strait of Malacca, the Suez Canal, the Panama Canal, received intensified attention with efforts to secure alternative routes and redundant transportation systems. Rail corridors through Central Asia, previously viewed primarily as economic initiatives, were reassessed for their potential to serve as lifelines in the event of maritime disruption. Ports, rail hubs, and cargo airports became once again assets of strategic national importance, blending civilian and military logistics in ways not seen since the mid-20th century. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on China banning critical material exports after Trump's new tariffs? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.